Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Let me start by saying that this is not exactly the press conference that I want to be hosting 1 week into my administration. The fact of the matter is we have the largest budget shortfall our state has ever faced. But as I said last week, there is not a single challenge that we won't meet. To give you some idea of the scope of the problem, currently, in the mid-year, we have a $750 million shortfall that we have to overcome. And for the fiscal year starting on July 1st, there is a $1.9 billion shortfall. And I want you to know that that $1.9 billion is not premised upon growing government. It doesn't account for any inflationary increase. It doesn't account for a 2.75% growth in the MFP, which is how we fund our K through 12 schools. It's not premised upon pay raises, merit raises for state employees. If we simply want to provide the state services next year that we are providing this year, we are $1.9 billion short. Now, conventional wisdom is that our budget problems are due to a sharp drop in oil prices. And certainly that is a contributing factor, but it is not the biggest factor that got us here today. For both the current and next fiscal year, a majority of our shortfall comes from an excessive use of one-time money and lower than expected revenue. So the days of using budget gimmicks that allowed us to limp along are over. We cannot have run-of-the-mill solutions for a historic problem like this. And certainly when the facts change, so must one's position on critical issues. This administration will remove the smoke and mirrors and provide the facts about where we are and where we need to go. And while we wish the circumstances were different, we have to accept the current state of our budget. Because if we do not act, and if we do not act responsibly and relatively quickly, you're going to see university and community and technical colleges are going to be struggling. Many will be forced into exigency, which is the equivalency of bankruptcy. You're going to see hospital closures. You're going to see TOPS scholarship money that will not be available. You're going to see the most severe cuts to public K through 12 education that we have ever seen, and that is true notwithstanding constitutional protections of the MFP. You will see other constitutionally protected items that would be subject to reductions, such as supplemental pay for law enforcement officials and even the Transportation Trust Fund. We've reached the end of the road, and while these threats are not new, because we do seem to hear them year after year, certainly the severity of the problems that we will have if we don't act are very real and much more pronounced than in the past. And in fact, as I mentioned earlier, they are of historical proportions. So over the last few days, I've met with leaders from the House and the Senate, including Speaker Barras and President Hilario, state legislators, and the statewide elected officials in my cabinet to go over these options. We recognize that there might well be other options out there to make the budget fix that we have to make, and we certainly welcome those conversations. And we will reach out not only to those individuals throughout the process, but to other individuals across the state and to different stakeholders and interest groups. But we're not going to stand for another round of political theater to block us from making the changes we need. And one of the changes that we're going to have is an honest, straightforward budgeting approach, where I've instructed Jay Dardenne, my Commissioner of Administration, that when he releases the executive budget on February the 13th, it will be based upon the revenue that we know to be available based upon the February 10th Revenue Estimating Conference report. And we are not going to have above the lines and below the line items. We're not going to have contingent spending. We're going to have a budget that reflects the amount of revenue that we have. Anything that's not in the budget would obviously be a cut if that budget were actually adopted. It won't be the budget that I want to adopt, but it's the budget I believe the law compels me and best practices compel me to produce. So simultaneously with the budget, we will also communicate with the legislature in a separate writing the amount of revenue that we would propose to raise, how we would propose to raise it, and then how we would allocate that revenue, incorporating it into the budget to avoid the cuts that will actually be reflected in the budget itself. But this is what it means when I say that we're going to clean up that budgeting process and have honest and straightforward budgets going forward. Now, I'm hopeful that we will continue to see the same willingness to work together to develop long-term solutions as we've seen over the last several days. Over the next 24 hours, I will continue to meet with different individuals, including community leaders, education leaders, and various stakeholders from across the state of Louisiana, representing many different businesses and industries. I am serious when I say that raising taxes would not be my first, second, or third option, but again, when the facts change, so must your position on certain issues. We can do better for Louisiana's future and our families and certainly our children than we have done over the last 8 years. That begins now. And because it begins now, that is why I'm so optimistic about our future, because we are going to tackle these challenges and we're going to have more opportunities here in Louisiana for future generations as a result. So at this point in time, I want to, before I introduce Jay and Kimberly and ask them to come forward and answer any questions that you may have, I want you to know that we are approaching this process as a way to deal with the current mid-year problem, provide a bridge to the future, to a new revenue structure, so that we can achieve a structure that is more consistent with best practices as outlined by the Tax Foundation, by Jim Richardson and other studies, so that we have a better platform for revenue going forward. But in the meantime, there does have to be a bridge in place because the need for additional revenue is now and it's acute. And so that will be the basis for the plan that you're about to be given by Jay and by Kimberly, should you have any questions. And I suspect that you probably will have a question or two. So I do want to thank you again for being here, and now I would ask that Jay and Kimberly come forward and answer any questions that you might have.
I guess let me say at the outset, I'm sure you may have some questions, that in looking at the short-term problem, the $750 million problem that we face, keep in mind that we're basically going to have March, April, May, June to deal with this. And by the time changes get put in place, we may only have 3 of those 4 months to deal with this. So short-term fixes are going to require some drastic moves, both on the revenue side and on the spending side. We will tap the rainy day fund to the tune of about $128 million, which can be done legally, will prevent us from using rainy day money in the future. And we'll be looking at a repositioning of the non-coastal dollars that are coming from BP. Those are 2 sources of money that we'll use to try and hit this $750 million problem head on. We'll also look to make about a 10% reduction in statutory dedications, stat deads. And we're working right now on identifying which ones those will be. We're going to protect the Medicaid vendor program, but those are some of the specifics on what we'll do in terms of the short-term fix. As the governor said, the bridge is very important, and we'll go over some of the options or answer your questions about it, but the bridge is going to be very important to deal with the short-term crisis and then to make sure we're prepared to make long-term fundamental structural changes in our budget and changes that will stabilize what we do as a government. The worst thing that we have faced over the course of the past several years is instability, and that serves nobody well. We want to stabilize this budget. We want to restructure it in an appropriate way as we go forward. And that's the approach we will take, and that's what we'll do as we're presenting the budget. Next year's budget is going to be free of inflation. It's going to be free of merit pay. It's not going to build any new programs into it. But it's going to also take money to be able to do what we're doing right now. So with that, I'll let Kimberly address any particulars on revenue side, and if y'all have questions, we'll answer them.
Yes, so we're looking at a 1% sales tax for state sales tax purposes. That would start as soon as the legislation passes. Ideally, April 1st would be the first month that it would be collected. And that would be what we call a clean penny, meaning most of the exemptions that are in statute would not apply to it. The constitutional exemptions, of course, on food, utilities, prescription drugs would still apply to that 1 penny. What we're looking at is this tax being a bridge as we look to long-term structural changes in the budget, including income tax changes and changes to other taxes within the area, including some of the things identified in both the Richardson, Sheffrin, and Alm study, as well as changes identified by the Tax Foundation. So we are looking at multiple pieces that deal with the income tax, and going back to some changes to the brackets as well as the excess itemized is a part of our plan. We're also looking at presenting the voters with a constitutional amendment that would allow them to repeal the federal income tax deduction in exchange for lowering the rates. The current rates are 2%, 4%, and 6%. So that is part of the long-term structural change that we're looking at. We have not finalized those thresholds, but we are expecting that they will be not the exact same thresholds that were in place for Stelly. But the first area is 0 to 12,500 for individuals, and we expect that that will be a constant. But we're looking at different levels for the top two. So it's $128 million in the rainy day fund. The current BP first portion settlement is $200 million. And statutory dedications, we're looking at $160 million, but that again is a matter of which debts are available to be touched this year, which ones have funds in them, and certain other things as far as the Commissioner indicated, Medicaid provider payments and things of that nature.
So just the $200 million this year to deal with the shortfall, and then the out years, the money continues for 15 or 16 years, some period of time, in lesser amounts. But the 200 would be recaptured from where it was dedicated by the legislature last year in order to address the shortfall that we've got for the current fiscal year, to avoid the literally devastating cuts that will be visited on every area of government if we don't do something like that.
And the other part of that is, if we didn't do that, we would take money from the rainy day fund to fix our problem and then immediately pay money back into the rainy day fund, which kind of gets us back to where we were several years ago.
The rainy day fund we can take another $128 million from the rainy day fund in this calendar year, which we're going to do. Add to that $200 million from the initial BP payment for economic losses that the state incurred. Add those two together, and they help address the $700 to $750 million problem. 1 cent sales tax plus the reductions in statutory dedications are the four key components of what we're proposing for the short term. And just to put this in perspective, and we've been working with the Office of Planning and Budget, the Legislative Fiscal Office, House and Senate, money folks, everybody that's involved in state government that understands our budget, understands the fiscal situation, has been involved in identifying exactly what the problem is and exactly what we need to do. To put it in perspective, there are about $800 million in one-time money in the current fiscal year budget. That's not going to happen again. We're not going to put continuing one-time excessive money in the budget. That's not to say there might not be some, but there's not going to be $800 million that has enabled us to limp along with recurring expenses based upon only one-time money. You're not going to see that happen again, and you're not going to see the kind of fund sweeps that everybody has seen over the course of the past 4 to 8 years, where funds have been drained, dedicated monies have been used to balance the budget in a fictitious way. Our budget has not been balanced in a responsible way, and we have to act responsibly. We have to be honest with the people of Louisiana as to where we stand, and that's what we're going to do. We're going to lay out a budget that's based upon the revenue we have, and the legislature and the people can decide if that revenue source is enough to run government the way it should be run.
Well, I did. I had an opportunity to visit with the speaker this morning, and we went through this list. And again, with respect to the mid-year problem, this takes on the shape of a plan. With respect to next year, it takes on the shape of a menu of options from which to choose. Although in order to close that shortfall, most of these items we believe will end up having to be selected. But the meeting I had with the speaker this morning was a good meeting. It was a frank discussion of the issues, and certainly he did not at that meeting tell me what his specific reaction was to any of the individual proposals, or to the list of proposals as a whole. He did share with me that he understands that we have a serious problem. That he certainly knows that we cannot address the problem only without raising revenue, I should say, because there just isn't enough there to be cut in terms of the impact that it would have, the devastating list of things that we talked about earlier. Well, all of these items have to be in the special session because the regular session this year, being that it's an even-numbered year, we can't do fiscal work. And in the regular session, we will be passing the budget for the next fiscal year, and the amount of revenue that we're going to have to incorporate into that budget will be determined by the actions taken in the special session, which I expect to start on February the 14th and end no later than March the 4th, 10 days before the regularly scheduled session. Yes, ma'am. Well, first of all, those things are on the list. The business utility is on the list. It's being considered. Well, the fact of the matter is we have an acute problem, both in terms of the amount of revenue needed and when it's needed. If you make structural changes on the income tax side, whether it's individual or corporate or both, any revenue to be derived from that you get much later. And the only way to access revenue that we need in order to stave off these horrendous cuts in terms of the current mid-year require a sales tax bridge. That's why we're talking about that so-called clean penny that Kimberly just went over, because, you know, as you know, or as I think you know, that's a tax that's available relatively soon after it's enacted.
What we're planning to do, sales tax collections will start on the first day of the month. So if the legislation is passed during the special session, which is expected to end March 4th, we would have those tax changes effective for the April 1st period. Collections would start then, and the returns would be ready for businesses to file with us in May. Realistically, unless the legislature decides that we are definitely correct about this and they implement it on February 15th, then we may be looking at March 1st, but realistically, it's April 1st.
We know that there's a $1.9 billion problem today. That figure is going to be updated when the REC meets. It could potentially get better. It may stay the same, or it might get worse. The indications are that it will actually get worse. I can tell you that on the list of options from which we can choose that we are proposing, not all of those items would need to be done. But we believe that the fix to the current problem lies in selecting from that menu of options. The $1.9 billion shortfall is not premised upon an inflation factor, merit raises, or even a 2.75% increase in K through 12 education. That is a strict continuation budget without inflation and those other things built into it. And so we are going to propose solutions to that problem, and we're going to work with the legislature to resolve that problem. And if the legislature believes that there's a certain percentage or amount of it wants to see, we're going to have those conversations as well. We're going to work in good faith and see where they would propose to make those cuts. I will tell you that when you have numbers this large, even if you know, because I've heard some individual legislators, for example, say they thought an approach that would be half revenue, half cuts, or 75% revenue, 25% cuts. 25% cuts is still $500 million. And go and talk to LSU and find out what will happen to them when they are allocated their share of $500 million in cuts, or any other community or technical college or regional university, or talk to your hospitals. Talk to your school board members in terms of not just not getting an increase in the MFP, but if we actually, for the first time, I'm not going to say the first time ever, but the first time I know of, actually reduce the amount of money available for K through 12 education. Certainly not something we should do while we're ranked 49th in terms of educational outcomes in K through 12. And again, we are open to different ideas, different approaches, and we're going to have those conversations with the legislators and with others. And that certainly includes if they want to take a look at specific cuts. We're going to sit down and look at them and see if there's a way that we can do that and still maintain our commitment to the people of Louisiana. There is not a specific plan underway that has been agreed upon to fund public defenders. I can only tell you money is fungible. And so to the extent that you have budgetary pressure anywhere, you have it everywhere, and there's more budgetary pressure than we've ever had in the history of the state. We are committed to trying to make sure that public defenders, indigent defenders are adequately funded so that we don't get to the place where Perhaps the Supreme Court would step in and talk about inadequate defense being available to criminal defendants and what that might do to our criminal justice system. We certainly would need to avoid that. But there is no plan to restore or to increase funding for that one particular area of the budget. It would be contingent upon us being successful in the plans that we're outlining today.
So, two different issues. Sales tax holidays apply to local bricks and mortar operations as well as any internet sellers that are in the state. What we're looking at on the internet sales tax side is truly those transactions that take place solely over the internet. Consumers receive the goods here in Louisiana. There was a fiscal note to the legislation that passed last year. It recognizes an increase, but doesn't specify a dollar amount. The language in the fiscal note then talks about somewhere in the range of $15 to $17 million coming into the state. So we're hopeful that that range is accurate and that the state would see increased revenue in the next fiscal year associated with internet sales tax. The current purchases on the internet are not sales tax free. They are subject to a use tax, and we're hoping that this improves compliance for those consumers who are misled into believing that it's sales tax free. But sales tax holidays, those are not a part of the plan currently. Yes, we did find that to be true for the changes that were passed during the 2015 session. Most had an effective date of July 1st. So there were a lot of returns filed prior to July 1st to use those credits at the full value as opposed to the 28% reduction that passed during the session, as well as to use those motion picture credits to have those funds rebated on the front end before the law changed July 1. So we did have what we're calling a run on credits. We are hoping that with some caps that were put in place on certain credits, that was a one-time only factor. The research and development tax credit is now non-refundable. There were also a lot of returns filed claiming that credit while it was still refundable.
Well, first of all, we're going to be proposing bills that look like what we handed out to you. And so we are in the process now of getting legislative authors. And of course, most of these measures have to originate in the House. And so that's where we're looking currently. And yes, I mean, look, I said earlier, this is not the way that I wanted to start my second week in office. But part of leadership is ownership. And we own this problem. We are going to fix it, and this is the way that we're proposing to do it. So I'm not going to shy away from associating myself with the bills that will enact what it is that I just handed to you. I can tell you that one of the things we're going to do is remove the sunset period, which we made some revisions last year to certain tax credits and rebates. I think we reduced them by 28%. However, that all those bills were sunsetted after 3 years, despite the fact that we have a structural budget problem that goes on as far as the eye can see at present. There was a 3-year sunset, which would just add another cliff if we don't remove them in order to resolve this structural budget deficit that we're in. And of course, the 3 years was artificial to begin with. That was an effort to satisfy Grover Norquist. That's not particularly a concern that I have. We would take those same revisions and just extend them out by removing the sunset. Well, look, thank y'all very much.